This video is going to anger a lot of Fate fans, I'm sure. You know, for the longest time, I've considered myself to be one. I got into the series with Fate Zero and have dedicated literal years to the rabbit hole that is this franchise. While I do still genuinely love Fate, I can't deny that some of its more infamous aspects have started to wear on me over the years. Today, I want to share some of these frustrations with you all. Please do try to understand that this video is very much based on my own personal opinions and experience. I'm not out to actively attack Fate or its fandom, but I just really need to share some of these feelings and get them off my chest. With all that out of the way, let's get started. For the uninitiated, Fate is a series that fundamentally revolves around battles between entities called heroic spirits, the living embodiments of legends from across human history. Anyone, from a famous person who left a significant mark on the world to a legendary hero straight out of mythology, can be a heroic spirit. Allegedly. We'll get back to that later. The point is that heroic spirits can be summoned into the world to fight over a magical wish-granting device called the Holy Grail. That's the broad strokes, at least. It gets way more complicated, but again, we'll get into that later. The Fate series is iconic, and rightfully so. It has genuinely well-written characters, thought-provoking storylines, and some truly breathtaking visuals at times. In spite of that, Fate also has its share of negatives, like any franchise. The plot is infamously convoluted with like a billion different timelines and alternate canons to keep track of, and that's not even getting into its connections to the broader Nasuverse, i.e. literally every single thing that the author, Nasu, has written is connected in some way, shape, or form. The question, where do I start trying to get into the Fate series, is infamous, to the point that it has been memed on endlessly. There have been entire online debates about this very subject, and I think that speaks volumes to how beginner-unfriendly the series is. The fact is that there is no one ideal jumping on point, because no matter where you start, your understanding of the plot is almost certainly going to be hindered if you aren't already familiar with the entire vocabulary of Nasuverse terminology, the differences between prana and mana, heroic spirits and ghostliners, dead apostles and true ancestors. The further in you go, the more this terminology becomes essential to understanding the plot, and the series will expect you to already have some degree of knowledge about all of this beforehand. So, have fun wiki diving and or looking at video essays on all of these disparate subjects. That being said, the knowledge of terminology is only going to help you so much because Fate loves to bend its rules and introduce new concepts all the time. It will introduce characters who are stated to be like something already established, but are technically their own thing and operate on slightly different rules as a result. Other times, it will just straight up break its own rules. Like, gods, aka divine spirits, can't be summoned as servants without being channeled into a human vessel until they can. Modern mages aren't supposed to be capable of magic rivaling that what was used in the Age of Gods, unless we need someone to do exactly that purely to establish what a badass they are. The criteria for who is and is not allowed to be a heroic spirit also seems to fluctuate constantly. And you want to know the real kicker? A lot of this convoluted lore is literally invented on the spot for the sake of a gag and or fan service. Like, take the Saberface situation. Originally, this was just a gag of how Fate kept introducing new characters who looked nearly identical to Artoria, aka the original Saber from Fate's Stay Night, despite having no relation to her whatsoever. The actual reason for this is because Saber is extremely marketable, and thus they will contrive whatever excuse they can to include her in a story event, even if she's not actually there. This has resulted in the creation of an entire running plotline involving hunting down Saber faces across the multiverse with characters like Mysterious Heroine X and all of her different variants. Fate does this sort of thing a lot, introducing a gag and then it creates a whole bunch of deep lore to try to justify it. like turning Thomas Edison into a furry. Why? Well, in the lore, he merged with the spirits of like a bunch of US presidents to try and save a weird alternate timeline version of America, and that, for some reason, turned him into a big dumb lion man. I think the actual reason is because it's supposed to be a reference to the MGM lion, since Edison is closely associated with the development of movies, but yeah, that's a stretch. Also, despite this manifestation of Edison supposedly being a one-off thing that only happened because of very specific circumstances, that's still the form he takes when he's summoned as a servant from now on, for whatever reason. We will never get to see him in an actual human appearance because this is Fate's version of Edison. Don't worry about it. Indeed, heroic spirits are able to permanently gain new forms and abilities because of weird nonsense that happens in singularities and lost spells, despite those both being perversions of proper human history and are not supposed to represent the main timeline version of a character. Hell, heroic spirits can gain entirely new powers and change classes for something as simple as putting on a swimsuit. They can transform their noble phantasms into modern-day vehicles or attire for seemingly no real reason at all, and it becomes increasingly clear that there are no actual rules beyond whatever seems most marketable at the time. Remember how I said that the criteria for who's allowed to be a heroic spirit tends to fluctuate? So apparently the freaking Voyager satellite is allowed to be one, and it also gets kind of mashed together with a few different fairy tales in the process. On the flip side, Shinji Muramasa, the most renowned blacksmith in Japan's entire history, is too weak or obscure to be summoned normally. So he has to be crammed into the body of Shiro Emiya, the original Fate Stay Night protagonist. Like, this is just so blatantly an excuse to have Shiro in FGO. But if you're going to do that, why not at least stick to the rules you established with other Stay Night fan service characters and put a god into his body instead? There's no end of forged deities you could have chosen from. All this does is ensure that we're way less likely to ever see what the actual Muramasa would be like as a heroic spirit. Same goes for characters like Rasputin, because he's now inside the body of Kirei Kotomine. And on the matter of fan service, let's talk about the gender bends. Fate has been gender bending its characters since pretty much the start, ever since it decided to introduce a female variant of King Arthur. Now, I will just say that I don't actually completely hate this concept. In fact, I think the original justification for it is actually slightly clever. Artoria had to pretend to be a man because of the actual historical biases and prejudices of the time. People would be more willing to follow the once and future king as opposed to the once and future queen. Putting aside that her outfit does a terrible job at actually masking her true gender, in fact, Mordred actually kind of pulls that off way better, it's a somewhat clever way to justify making King Arthur into a waifu, even if, again, it was ultimately just done for the sake of fan service. I think Frankenstein's monster also does this concept pretty cleverly. Rather than a full-on gender swap, it's more of a role reversal. In the actual story of Frankenstein, the monster is male and tries to force his maker to create a bride for him, so he wouldn't be lonely. However, Victor cowards out and destroys the bride, leaving the monster to take his own life and that of his maker. In Fate, the bride is actually the one who came first, and her wish is to have a groom. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the gender bends aren't so cleverly done. Typically, they fall into one of three categories. Either it's an alternate timeline version of the main male heroic spirit, who will show up way before the male one ever does. The hero got merged with a female entity and that resulted in their gender changing, or my personal favorite, they were just always female and history somehow misremembered them as male. And of course, the gender bends are always male to female because that's what will draw the most horny weebs to the mobile games gacha. And honestly, that's the most baffling part to me. Like, whatever the in-lore justification might be, We all know that the gender bends are just fan service at the end of the day, a way to add more waifus that people can simp for. Thing is, that doesn't even really feel necessary. Like, there are so many famous female figures in history and mythology that Fate still hasn't touched on at the time of this video. Mary Curie, Grace O'Malley, Amelia Earhart, Draupadi, Baba Yaga, Lauhi. So many options, yet Fate insists on sidelining them for the sake of giving male characters an extra X chromosome. I frankly do not understand it. In fact, there are times when Fate's roundabout attempts to justify its own weirdness can come off as arguably kind of offensive. Like, look at what they did to Vincent van Gogh. So, the reason he looks this way is because he merged with Clytie, an ocean nymph from Greek myth who became the first sunflower, purely because Vincent made a painting of sunflowers. Oh, and this also led to him getting partially merged with Volthoom, an eldritch deity that vaguely resembles a flower. In fact, Fate's portrayal of the character actually has him taking his own life not just due to depression, but as a desperate attempt to stop Volthoom from possessing him. So, like, it was a noble and heroic thing that he took his own life? That is just no, on so many levels. Beyond warping characters' backstories whenever they want, the creators behind Fate also take some extreme liberties with character design. Now, as I said in a previous video, character design is not exactly my area of expertise. But there's a reason why Guess the Fate character is such a popular game to play here on YouTube. A good number of heroic spirits are effectively impossible to guess from their designs alone. Not only do many of them suffer from extremely pointless levels of fan service, but whether or not they will even attempt to match the aesthetics of their region or the part of the world they're from is basically a roll of the dice. Like, why the fuck is Queen Boudica, a hero of the ancient Celtic world, dressed in white and gold underwear? What's with Lancelot and Agravain wearing dark colors when nearly every other Knight of the Round Table we see has silver or white armor? And that's not even getting into the impracticality of these outfits, which itself would not be a massive problem if Fate didn't constantly put its over-the-top anime characters next to more sensibly dressed NPCs and background characters that look as though they come from a completely different world. Hell, even among servants there's no consistency. Sometimes an effort is made to fit them with the vibes of their era and homeland, while other times they clearly could not give less of a fuck. I know the series has brought a lot of guest artists on over the years, but that excuse can only carry you so far. And yet, in spite of all of that, I still love the Fate series. When it tries, this franchise has been able to put me through hype, dread, and genuine philosophical thought. When it wants to, Fate can be more than just battles between iconic figures in human history. It can be commentary on humanity itself, both the pros and the cons. Despite all its needlessly convoluted lore, pointless fan service, and infuriatingly bad habits, I don't regret getting into the Fate franchise in the slightest. There are many low points with this series, but the highs are some of the highest I've ever seen. There's a reason why Fate has managed to endure and keep both old and new fans invested for so long. Fate is something I hold dear to my heart, even though it brings me endless amounts of frustration and grief. I'll probably continue to try and keep up with it for as long as I can, in spite of all my complaints. Like a certain angsty Frenchman once said, love and hate are but two sides of the same coin. I suppose that's what it means to be a Fate fan.